Alabama is the most interesting team in college football.
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, and more. We've always got you covered. This episode brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. We're predicting Ole Miss's record and Oklahoma's record. It's an SEC kind of show today. And we're starting with Alabama because here's how I view them as the most interesting team. Some of you might say Colorado because what are they going to be in year two under Deion? We're going to talk about them later in the week. What about Clemson? They're not using the transfer portal. Yeah, that's interesting as well. The reason Alabama is the team I'm most interested to see this year is because I feel that the fan reactions to Alabama could be among the most entertaining. Because when the greatest coach in the history of this sport, modern era, past era, whatever, I'll take Nick Saban up against anybody, and I think most people will as well. When he retires, there's, of course, a void. And you don't know who's going to fill that void. And you can allow in your mind, as a college football fan, a year of transition, a year of, I don't know if they're going to be what they have been. I don't know if Alabama is going to continue to be this dominant power player in college football. But even if they are, well, they won't do it in the first year. They won't do it in the first year. Kalen DeBoer could scare the pants off of everybody if he does what I've predicted him to do, and that's go 11-1 this year and make an appearance in the SEC championship game. Can you imagine if he wins that game? If he walks into the conference this year with a roster that is good, it's one of the 10 best in college football. I don't think it's one of the 5 best in college football. And you would see him win the SEC and you'd think, well, wait a minute. We had questions about his recruiting first, which people did. I thought those were fair questions. The early returns here, he's answered those questions. Does he have to do it year after year after year? Yeah, but I think it's apparent that Alabama brand is going to carry with it a good amount of weight for him to kind of flash his moxie on the recruiting trail. So if that question gets answered, and then the on-field component gets answered, and by the way, this would have been a much different conversation, let's say 12 years ago. 12 years ago, the SEC was about hard-nosed defense. It was about stopping guys. And even Nick Saban adapted and said, yeah, we're just going to recruit all the best offensive players to go score a bunch of points. Last time Alabama won a national championship, they had the best offense in college football. They had the Heisman Trophy winner at wide receiver. They had a first-round quarterback in Mac Jones. They had a bunch of guys everywhere. Back in 2012, if Kalen DeBoer had taken this job with the track record he had at Washington in that time, the question would have been, can you have an offensive-leaning coach just walk into the SEC and score points? Can he really do that against these defenses? But when you know in the modern age of college football that he can, that question has been answered. The only question that remains is, how does he fare head-to-head with the coaches in the SEC? He just went up against the Pac-12 and he kind of clowned everybody over there. He lost all of 2, count them 2 Pac-12 conference games, the lowest the league had been in about a decade or so. But now you're going to the SEC. It's a stronger league. You have more high-end national championship caliber teams and programs on an annual basis. Can he sustain it? Because I've seen him be a head coach at a power program for all of 2 years. His track record is incredible. He has lost 12 football games as a head coach. Spencer, how long has he been a head coach for? Well, why don't you go back to his time at the NAIA ranks at Sioux Falls, and you'll see he has been a long-time tenured head football coach because he's won over 100 games. So if he carries that into Alabama immediately, if in year 1, which, to paraphrase a Deion Sanders quote, is the most gettable he's likely to ever be at Alabama, and he still keeps the Tide on top, you're going to have a section of the college football fan base that are going to groan. that are going to roll their eyes and go, oh, Alabama? Still? Alabama? There was supposed to be a change. There was supposed to be a shifting of the guard because this is an inflection point. Major programs that have been power players, dynasties in the sport, have had them several times over the decades. Go find the inflection point for Miami. When did they stop becoming a perennial national title contender? Nebraska, Colorado, keep going down the list. Tennessee, the list goes on. And you have plenty of people out there, whether they'd admit it publicly or not, that are wishing, hoping, pleading, maybe even praying that Alabama is facing one of these moments because they're tired of going up against the Tide. They're tired of them recruiting at a high level and winning conference championships and winning national championships and beating their team. Tennessee beat Alabama back in 2022. It had been a very long time since that had happened. Didn't always used to be that way. Tennessee was one of those programs that was at the top of the sport all the time. Now they're trying to find their way back up to the mountaintop. Much like the Dolphins are trying to find their way back up, or the Bills are trying to find their way back up now that the Patriots have finally fallen off. But if Kalen DeBoer is as good as many people, myself included, think he is and can be in this role at Alabama, you're just going to have some eye rolls. You're just going to have some, all right, we just got to accept it. We just got to Alabama's still going to be really, really good because it's always a coaching change that causes a national power to cease being a national power when the wrong hire is made, when it doesn't work out. But if Alabama still looks like the Tide in year one, with all this turnover and recruiting classes that have been very good, but you didn't keep everybody around. Caleb Downs isn't on that field anymore. Caden Proctor is, of course, and he'll be one of Alabama's starting tackles this year. But this was the opportunity. This could be. I shouldn't say was, because the season, of course, hasn't happened yet. 17 days. Just think about that. 17 days is how long we have to wait from now until the first Power 4 college football game is played. If that doesn't fire you up, I don't even know what you're doing listening to or watching this show. Appreciate you all being here. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @SMcLaughlinCFB. Ole Miss might have the best roster Lane Kiffin has ever put together in Oxford. What's the record going to be this year? I've got one game on my official prediction for Ole Miss, which is coming up next, and it's going to surprise you. First, this episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. You can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc., whatever you're looking for. You can also get all-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. For the third time in 4 years, Ole Miss is winning 10 regular season games, and that should put them into the college football playoff. That is Steven Willis, Locked On Ole Miss, joining me here on the show. We're breaking down this Ole Miss schedule because it's interesting. It's very Ole Miss-like, Steven, in that the first few weeks, not a lot of people are going to watch very many Ole Miss games because it's a Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake, Georgia Southern. People will tune in for the Kentucky game. That's about it. But I am hard-pressed with the returners they have, the offseason that they have had. Lane Kiffin's still there. I'm hard-pressed to see Ole Miss doing anything but starting 5-0.
Well, now that fall camp has begun and everything, the story around Ole Miss is the fact that Lane Kiffin is taking a very NFL approach to fall camp to where they've had 3 practices in 5 days. They've had a ton of classroom time. They've had a ton of walkthroughs, but they're trying to slowly ramp up. And a lot of that, in my opinion, is those first games. when you look at it, like Furman and MTSU and Georgia Southern, and even on the road at Wake Forest, because they have the time to make that ramp. It's like you say, it's a very Ole Miss-like schedule.
I think this is the most talented Ole Miss team that the Rebels have had in the Lane Kiffin era. I mean, the transfer portal class.
In my lifetime.
It's not in your lifetime. And you've been an Ole Miss fan for how long?
My first Ole Miss game was Steve Sloan's last, which was in '82.
Folks, did you hear the speed and accuracy with which he whipped that one out? There was no hesitation. That's burned into his brain right there. That's a guy who's seen a thing or two. But I see the 5-0 start, and we've seen Lane Kiffin teams do that before, and their season will be defined by the second half of their schedule. But I have an upset on here, Steven. I think that Kentucky game, which will be the first real kind of test, Wake Forest is not anything special in the ACC. They at least have a Power 4 non-conference opponent on there, but Wake is not going to be anything special. Furman, Middle Tennessee, Georgia Southern. I think Kentucky will be a good look, but Kentucky doesn't wow me the way that Ole Miss does. But every year, teams stumble. It's usually away from home, and I'm picking an upset here. South Carolina over Ole Miss in Game 6. This is one of the two losses that I have on Ole Miss's schedule here in 2024. I think they are going to go to the Gamecocks and walk home with their first loss. Am I insane?
You're not insane. And I do not think that South Carolina is going to be particularly good this year. And I do think Ole Miss is probably going to be about a 10-point favorite in that game. But if you look at the schedule, you can see that the next week is the game at Tiger Stadium against LSU, and everybody is pointing to that game. South Carolina and Williams-Brice Stadium is a very difficult place to play, and we saw them against Tennessee a couple of years ago have one of those weird nights where they were to put it together at Williams-Brice. So if you had to pick an upset, that is probably one of the places that I would look for it. I do not personally think that that's going to happen, but I can see where your thought was.
The other consideration for a potential upset, and I don't think every team is going to get majorly upset throughout the course of their 2024 season. The other one I looked at was Florida, but quite frankly, I don't know. The look-ahead factor that you mentioned is a big part of the reason that I landed on that South Carolina game. But do not fear, Rebels fans. I am not here to crap on Ole Miss and say it's going to be the same old, and you're not going to run with the big kids and you can't do it. No, I think they are going into Death Valley and walking out with a win. I hope it's every bit as crazy as it was a season ago, as someone who doesn't have a specific dog in that particular fight. But I think they win at LSU. I think they come back home riding high off the win, feel like they've righted the ship. They'll be back in the top 10 after the loss to South Carolina. Then they will come back home. And I think Oklahoma's good, but I think Ole Miss is better. And I'll take the Rebels in Oxford. And those two wins right there, if you win both of those games, even if you have the South Carolina loss, I think Ole Miss cements themselves as a playoff team, barring a collapse down the stretch.
Yeah, 10 wins, I think, is a necessity. Now, a lot of people like to think of it's like 10 wins might not be enough from the SEC. It's like, don't listen to that. Every year, hypothetically, they can make it where a 10-win team does not make it in, but that's not the way this works. If Ole Miss wins 10 in the regular season, they're going to the playoff.
I think so as well. Here's the caveat. What if they win 10? And, in my schedule predictions, I'm not lining up the tiebreakers here because it can get wonky and weird and whatnot now that there are no divisions and such. What if they go to the SEC championship game and lose? What if they're sitting there at 10-3? Kind of a conundrum for the playoff committee, isn't it, Steven?
The first time that a team goes into the SEC championship game with the idea that they're going to the to the playoffs and they lose and they don't make the playoffs is the last year that we have the championship game.
I think that is put exceptionally well because I tend to agree. And if you look at the SEC championship games over the years, it tends to be a matchup of one loss or undefeated teams. And I've said for a long time on this show that I think the SEC championship game matchup is going to have one loss or undefeated teams in it. So the loser is a de facto auto bid into the playoff, because if you're an 11-2 SEC team, you're in. It was just food for thought. I think your point is very well taken. So LSU, Oklahoma, I like the wins. At Arkansas, I don't see a stumble there. I think Sam Pittman has a less than 50% chance of being the head coach of the Razorbacks in 2025, and that's just the way that things have gone. He's had a nice run, but I think it's going to come to a head this year, and I don't anticipate Ole Miss stumbling there. Then they come back home for, gosh, it's got to be one of the biggest games in Oxford in the last decade, Steven. You're going to have probably top-ranked Georgia coming in. The point spread's going to be under 5. It's going to be in favor of the Dogs. Last I looked, it was 4.5, 5.5 in that sort of range. I think it'll be less than that once LSU and Oklahoma both succumb to the prowess of Ole Miss. But I do think Georgia goes into Oxford and walks out a winner. I think, hot take here, Steven, I'm bullish on Georgia.
Yeah, it's the best roster in college football. Everybody else is playing college football, and they basically have a UFL roster with the talent that Georgia has at the moment. And there's no shame in losing that game, but Ole Miss can win it.
Yep.
But the stars are going to have to align for that to happen.
They absolutely will. But that's the last loss of the season until they get to the playoff, and we see what the matchups are. At Florida, hosting Mississippi State, I think you've got a mismatch there in the coaching sense. I think you've got a mismatch in the roster sense. I don't anticipate those being problematic games for Ole Miss. So that's how I land on the Rebels ending the season 10-2 and into the college football playoff.
Yeah, 10-2, they would probably be on that close to that 8-9 line, depending on, that early South Carolina loss, and then you lost to Georgia. So maybe you've put yourself in a position to potentially host, depending on where you sit. If Ole Miss hosted a playoff game, that would be the biggest football game in the state of Mississippi history. There would be 300,000 people in Oxford for that game. And picture Ole Miss against Notre Dame, Ole Miss versus a Michigan team, Ole Miss versus Penn State, a rematch of last year's Peach Bowl. I just think that could be nuts. It'd be
how about this one? How about Ole Miss and Oregon, and that way we can go down and hang out in the Grove together. How about that? Does that sound like a good time?
Yeah, that would be absolutely fantastic. And Puddles the Duck could make an appearance in Oxford.
yeah, the duck would be down there. Do you guys have any waterways where the giant inflatable duck could go?
Sardis Reservoir is down, 15 miles.
Perfect. Yeah, that'll do. We can get they can set up a Photoshop
or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's speak that into existence. Steven Willis. So you have Ole Miss. You have Ole Miss 11-1. Just to clarify, yes.
Yes, 11-1. Ole Miss is going to be favored likely at kickoff in 11 of the 12 games. So if it goes chalk, that would be how they would end up. And I don't see any reason to think that it won't go chalk, because Lane Kiffin usually wins games he's supposed to win.
No, that's why they play the games, as they say. Steven Willis, Locked On Ole Miss. Fantastic stuff. We both like Ole Miss winning at least 10 games. If you can still get their win total at 9.5 over at FanDuel, bet that over. Steven, appreciate it as always.
Appreciate it, Spencer.
We're staying in the SEC. How's Oklahoma going to fare? They're losing to Ole Miss. Who else are they losing to? That's coming up next. Oklahoma's going to have a tough time in the SEC, depending on what you define as a tough time. That's Jay Smith, Locked On Sooners, joining me here to predict Oklahoma's schedule game by game. We may not agree. Now, look, I'm saying tough time by Oklahoma standards in the Big 12. Do I think Oklahoma is in a bad place? Do I think they're a bad team? Not necessarily, no. Florida, on the other hand, look, that's going to be rough, okay? It's just going to be... Oklahoma isn't on Florida's level, but gosh almighty, Jay, their schedule is set up in a way that isn't that far off. The SEC did the Sooners no favors here, and it's why I don't see them getting to 9 wins.
And no, I can see that when you look on the outside looking in. First and foremost, for the uninitiated, the way the SEC set these schedules up, I know Oklahoma got a tough one, so did Florida. And supposedly Mississippi State's is hard as well, but they took the teams based upon the last time they did an expansion, which was 2012, when Missouri and A&M came in, and they took their conference winning percentages and they stack ranked them from there. Unfortunately for us, they took ours and Texas's. So we were at the top. Texas is right there at the bottom. Mainly because Texas sucked up until basically the last couple of years. They've had a few moments in between there on the last 12, but in comparison, they were terrible compared to us. So that's why you see Oklahoma with such a tough schedule, similar to what you're seeing Alabama and Georgia have, because we were all winning in our conference like crazy. So yes, we got a tough one. And getting to 9 games, intriguing that you made mention of that. I don't think it's as tough as a path as everybody's trying to make it out to be, personally.
I think that hinges on 2 games in particular, so let's get into it. They start with Temple, Houston, and Tulane. Now, Tulane, under new head coach Troy Summerall, they've brought in some talent via the transfer portal. Former Oregon 5-star quarterback Ty Thompson is competing to be the starter. He might not actually win the job down there, but Tulane is a good team. They're going to be at the top of the American Conference, but Oklahoma's going to win that football game. Houston's going to be last place in the Big 12. Temple's also in the American. I don't see any problems there. And I actually think Oklahoma wins their SEC opener at home against Tennessee, because I like Tennessee. I'm not in love with Tennessee. So if you're having me pick a particular game, and I feel kind of the same way about Oklahoma. I like them. I just don't know if I love them. I have questions about Tennessee on the defensive side of the ball. I have questions about Oklahoma's offensive line and Jackson Arnold in his first full season as a starter. But Tennessee's working in a new quarterback as well. That's going to be a hostile environment. I think Oklahoma starts 4-0, and much like last year, it's a sizzling start for Brent Venables. I think they start the season with 4 straight wins.
Yeah, I'm in 100% agreement with you there. And I like Tennessee as well. I like what they're doing and the direction they're going. Josh Heupel, shout out to him, Oklahoma's former national championship winning quarterback. So, we got a little love for him in the area. But the big thing with Tennessee, similar to Oklahoma, breaking in a new quarterback. Now, what helps them is they're bringing back a very experienced offensive line with a few new pieces to, fill some holes that they had. And Oklahoma's replacing its entire front 5, right? But that's kind of a tradition as old as the game itself when it comes to our offensive line coach, Bill Beatonbow. He's been there 13 years. He's outlived just about every other offensive line coach in the SEC.
That's a rarity nowadays. That is an extreme rarity nowadays.
That's the saving grace and why you hear Sooner fans being more bullish about the line, because we're used to this dude. When he gets the players he wants, he's good. Another component to that is Jerry Schmitty, our strength and conditioning guy, the director of performance or whatnot. He worked at Oklahoma from the national championship years up until about 14. He went to Texas A&M back when Texas A&M was actually doing well. And then he came back to Oklahoma. And you saw the big dudes they had at A&M. Heck, they pulled out a W against Nick Saban and Alabama in their prime. So Schmitty knows how to build dudes for the SEC. He's back building offensive lines and defensive lines and players for the SEC. So that's why we're so bullish. For Tennessee, the bigger thing is that defense. They lost just about everybody in the secondary, and I think they just had another injury that may have ruined a lot of their hope when it comes to replacements. We're bringing back the most experienced defense in the country, right? One of the most experienced. We're number 3 in returning production at 86%, number 1 in the SEC. That's why I don't think it's going to be that much of a problem. Tennessee, we know what Heupel's going to do because Brent Venables used to battle Josh Heupel in practices for years when they both were Oklahoma. So for us, the bigger thing is the expectations our defense is going to carry us forward.
I think for Oklahoma, after that Tennessee game, they'll be riding high, they'll be feeling good. They have to go to Jordan-Hare, and they have to play Auburn. And this is one of the 2 games that I talked about earlier. If you want to get to 9 victories for Oklahoma this season, Red River, we'll get to that in just a moment. Always going to be huge for Oklahoma to have a successful season. But I think to get to 9 wins, they have to win both at Auburn and at Missouri. And I think they're going to split those games because I think they're kind of in the toss-up category, but I'm not using my one toss-up that I get on schedules if I decide that I want to have one there. I'm not using that on the Missouri or the Auburn game. I think in some order, you pick them whichever way you like. If they lose at Auburn, I think they'll end up beating Missouri. I think they're just 2 games between fairly evenly matched teams. They're both on the road, but I do like Oklahoma a little bit more. I think Missouri might be more likely of a team to win, quite frankly, than Auburn. I think Auburn's had a really, really nice offseason, but I could see them beating Auburn and losing to Missouri. I could see them losing to Missouri and beating Auburn. Either way, I think that's how those two games play out. If you want to get to 9 wins, you have to win both. But that's where I put the first automatic loss on the schedule is either Auburn or Missouri, but not both.
And that's a fair argument there, and I see what direction you're coming from. This is my argument on the opposite side. Of course, my job is here to be the contrarian and be on the Oklahoma side. Is going up against Auburn, the bigger problem is currently their quarterback still Peyton Thorne, right? He's regressed every year since he had threw for 3,000 yards at Michigan State. He's continuously gone backwards every single year. Now, we got Hugh Freeze trying to figure it out. But the fact that they actually had run a 2-quarterback system with him because they weren't sure of who was going to be the starting quarterback told me everything I needed to know. Now, next season, Auburn's going to be a problem. This is Hugh Freeze's second season, right? He's still getting things going, getting things rolling. Those skills position guys are starting to get there, right? Coleman? Yeah, he's going to be a beast, right? I don't know if Auburn's defensive line is going to be as good as it needs to be this season. Next season, sure. This season's really young. They brought in Phil Bleeding, defensive lineman that we actually courted at one point as a transfer
from Indiana,
to kind of really be the main guy because they need some interior guys. We got Dominic Williams and we still have Dejon Terry, who spent 2 years at Tennessee, and he's seen SEC fronts, right? So for us, I think our defense is going to give them problems on the offensive side of the ball. And at that point, Jackson Arnold should have more comfort because this is the other beauty for Oklahoma. We brought back all our skills position guys. Wide receivers, 4 wide receivers, and we added one more additional one, which was one of the top guys in the portal. So Nick Anderson caught 700 yards, 10 touchdowns, right? Jane Gibson, he had 17 catches, about 400 yards, and he had like 3 touchdowns. Jalil Farouk is back, one of our veteran guys. If he doesn't fumble the ball, he's going to get you about 700 yards in a season, no problem, right? And then Deion Burks, who got over about 690 yards from Purdue last year.
The
he
Burks
was
edition.
Always
love it.
Wide open. This offense is built for Jackson Arnold to throw that ball deep, right? Get him to boom, 1, 2, 3, launch it. One of those dudes is going to be open. So I think Auburn's going to have a bigger problem holding our guys. And honestly, I think Missouri's going to have the exact same problem. What helps Missouri is their offense is really good, right? Brady Cook's coming back. He's bringing back his wide receiver room. So he's got his skills guys at the wide receiver spot. They had to bring in 2 transfer running backs. Which one's going to stand out? The Georgia State guy, right? I mean,
right.
You got questions there for me.
Yeah. So with the rest of the schedule, I'm sticking to my guns. I hear your points. I'm sticking to my guns on the Auburn, Missouri. That's going to be a split. Texas is my toss-up game. I'm not in August going to pick Red River. I mean, come on. I got to see more there. There's just so much at play. South Carolina at home, fine. At Ole Miss, I like Ole Miss a lot. I think they've had a great offseason. I think going to Oxford, I would probably pick Ole Miss even if this game were in Norman, but it's in Oxford, so I'm really confident picking Ole Miss there. Then you come down the stretch. Oklahoma plays Maine. They've got that Missouri game, and then Bama and at LSU. I've got 2 losses there to end the year. At home against Bama, I'm bullish on the Tide and Kalen DeBoer and what he can do with Jalen Milroe this year and the roster that they have put together. I don't think they'll win the national championship. I do think they will be in the SEC championship game again. And then having to go at LSU, gosh, that's tough. That's tough. And that's how I land on Oklahoma at either 8-4, 7-5. And I don't think that's bad or terrible. And I think it hinges upon those 2 games, Missouri and Auburn. And I've got a toss up in Red River. That's where I come down on the Sooners, and why I think by their historical standards, where 10-2 last year was kind of a disappointing year at some level because of what they were capable of, why I think they have somewhat of a disappointing season.
I can see that. I can see where you're going with that in the case on it. For me, the Ole Miss game is going to be tough. Lane Kiffin's got that team. He should have the team.
Good
rolling.
roster. That's a
He's
really
got a very
good
roster. But they're infamous for underachieving with those good rosters, right? Especially against teams that
they haven't had rosters. They haven't had rosters like this. Earlier on this show, Steven Willis, Locked On Ole Miss, said, and I quote, "It's the best Ole Miss roster of my lifetime."
Okay, and that's a fair assessment. I could totally see that. Let me see Lane Kiffin and Pete Golding actually do something with it, right? Pete Golding left Alabama for a reason. So for me, I just need to see it actually executed on. If they execute on it, I wouldn't be surprised. But to me, my big thing is with a lot of these teams and a lot of these coaches, I need to see you do it, right? Show me you can do it. We've beat Texas in our neutral site game before, right? We've shown that we can muscle them around.
That's why I'm not picking. Like, on the surface,
right. And I tell people, I ain't touching it. Because when we've been our best, Texas has been at their worst, they beat us. It's like everybody talks about Jordan Harris being cursed. Red River, it's always a toss-up, regardless, because there's enough hate there that teams care. Right now, Texas, some Texas fans and some of the Texas insiders are pretending like it's not a big deal anymore. Come on, guys, let's not play that game. But anyway, I get you with the Ole Miss one. Alabama, I have questions. I don't have concerns, but I do have questions. Right? Kalen DeBoer's come in there. His former tight end coach is now the offensive coordinator, so they don't have Ryan Grubb, who was running things up there in Washington.
He was very good.
Whose offense is this going to be? Right? That's what I'm curious about. Was it Kalen DeBoer that was making this happen, or was it Grubb?
I think DeBoer's track record as both head coach and offensive coordinator, going back to his time at Indiana, that's where my confidence comes down.
True.
His track record with quarterbacks is so good, and Milroe, I think, is primed to take a big leap forward.
And I think that same thing for our offensive coordinator, Seth Luttrell, right? So Seth Luttrell spent time in Indiana. He was at Arizona with Nick Foles and Rob Gronkowski. Nick Foles threw for over 4,000 yards there. Got himself drafted to the NFL. Sounds like a pretty good thing, right? He also spent some time at North Carolina, had one of the top offenses, and actually helped North Carolina get to the ACC championship game when he was there. Marquise Williams threw for over 3,000 yards, ran for almost 1,000. Little numbers there. So for me, it's Luttrell knows quarterbacks and he knows offenses, and him and Bill Beatonbow worked together at Arizona, which, again, our offensive line coach has been here about 13 years. He's bringing back his old offensive coordinator, and they're working together. So for me, I'm curious to see what DeBoer does with this talent at Alabama. This is, of course, the most talented team he's ever had. Washington team was elite, but
last
this
year's
is
Washington
Alabama.
Team was very good.
It was really, really good.
Had a
But
lot
I don't
of
think
that.
he had the same defense as he's got here at Alabama.
No, I agree.
That wide
I agree.
receiver room
Yes.
is where the questions come in, right?
Right. But I mean,
don't
quarterback,
know.
offensive line, wide receivers, I think last year's team had more overall talent, but I agree.
Agreed.
Defensively, I think they've got more horses. So I have Oklahoma at
Yeah.
8-4 or 7-5, depending on what happens in Red River. You have Oklahoma's final record being what?
10-2.
10-2. Jay Smith, higher than me. That's why he's Locked On Sooners. Jay, appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, Spencer.
Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.